Hey everybody, it's Lindsay with High Altitude Astrology, and I'm excited to bring you another reading today. I've decided to do a more uplifting chart because I feel that a lot of the charts I've been focusing on lately have to do with people who are going through a lot of challenges. But today I wanted to look at the chart of Billy Idol. And the reason for this is because I saw him recently perform on the program called The Voice, and it got me researching as to what he's been up to lately. And you can find a really cool video of him and Miley Cyrus singing Rebel Yell together at the iHeartRadio event earlier this year. And he's also getting ready to go on tour next year, mainly in Europe, but there are a few shows in the States. So his career is just still, plugging along, and I was curious to know why and more about who he is. Now, I have to also say that I am a product of the 80s, so I grew up watching MTV with my two older sisters. So he was definitely my sort of rock god growing up. And in fact, I have a brief story of when I was at camp. We had each cabin had to do a lip sync at this event, and my cabin chose to lip sync to Billy Idol, and I was Billy Idol in that event. So I've just had this fondness for him for a long time. And I wanted to look into his chart and find out more about who he is and what makes him tick. Well, he is, if you'd like to follow along, was born on November 30th, 1955 in Stanmore, England in the UK, and there was a birth time of 4 p.m. on the internet. So Billy is a Sagittarius sun at 7 degrees, conjunct Mercury at 5 degrees Sagittarius. So right there, that just tells us that his identity has to do with making his world bigger, expanding his perspective and expanding the perspective of those around him. Now, I do know that he was in school, in college, studying English literature for a brief amount of time before he decided to leave all of that and work on his career as a singer and performer. So that to me makes sense to have his Sun Mercury conjunction. You know, that's somebody who identifies with knowledge and information, but also in the sign of Sagittarius, it's about wanting to expand the knowledge, expand the perspective. So that seems a fitting thing for him to have been studying at that time. Well, what's also interesting about his chart is that his sun is in the 7th house. Now, normally, well, I should say it's on the cusp of the 7th house, but that makes it a 7th house sun. Well, normally you would think, well, his identity focuses in the area of relationships. But interestingly, he's never been married. He has had a long relationship with somebody, I believe, sort of in the 80s, and from which he had one child. But again, never married. But what's interesting is that the lesson of the 7th house sun person seems to be about trying to find harmony and balance in their self-expression in relationships. And what this may entail is perhaps learning about boundaries, learning not to sacrifice the self too much, because that can be sort of the downfall or the negative side of Libran energy, is that they want harmony and balance so much that they're willing to sort of give up their own needs for that. So that's a little bit about having a 7th house sun. But what's also interesting is that he is a Sun Uranus trined person. So his sun trines Uranus. So this is going to make him a different 7th house sun energy, because Uranus is about freedom. And so his identity is also very much tied up with his need for freedom. And because Uranus is also a transpersonal planet, which means because it moves so slowly, it symbolizes energy that people experience in generations. So Uranus, which is about our freedom-seeking energy, but it's connected to that larger generational group and how they choose to seek freedom. His solar energy, his identity, is connected to the Uranian energy of his generation. So in some ways, he was a pioneer for the energy, the freedom-seeking energy of his generation. And here are a few quotes that I think definitely relate to him being a Sun trine Uranus person. I've done things that I love, and that's what makes me happy. The goal when I wanted to create music was to create my own style. And that particular style was a rebellion against the music in the 70s that he and the youth of that time felt like they could no longer relate to. Because from what I understand, the people who were popular in the 70s had made a lot of money, the musicians, and the kids weren't able to identify so much with what those people were singing about or the music they were making. So what happened was punk rock came about, and Billy was a part of the punk rock generation in the UK. He was originally a part of a band called Generation X, and that's where he got his start. But we also can't forget that he was a trailblazer for the MTV era. And if you think about it, Uranus deals with technology and innovative advancements. And you could definitely think of MTV as that. So, you know, his energy, his nature was perfect for kind of hitching his wagon to this new way of sharing music with the world through these music videos. And he claims that he really enjoyed being able to bring in the physical or the visual experience to music through that music video process. So he also, we're still talking about his sun, he also is a Sun square Jupiter person. And this is interesting because Jupiter is his star of destiny, being a Sagittarius, but it actually squares his solar energy. And this can just mean that at times, you know, Jupiter gives us a lot of confidence, especially when it's connected to the sun, but perhaps at times there's overconfidence with the square, you know, and you have to learn how to kind of contain or control that, you know, exuberance that he obviously has. And I just want to go back, when I first said that he's just a Sagittarius, you can see it in him. He's got a sense of humor. If you look at any of his videos on YouTube, he's always kind of got a little smile going on, and he definitely has a sense of humor that he shares. And those are very Sagittarian qualities because they're ruled by Jupiter, which is the largest planet in the solar system, and it is symbolic of joviality, and it's symbolic of expansion and growth, you know, and that person that wants to broaden their horizons and broaden the horizons of others. So there's definitely sort of an uplifting quality to his solar nature being a Sagittarius. But I wanted to read what Sue Tompkins talks about with people who have their sun squared Jupiter. And she writes, Sun-Jupiter people are great visionaries, intuitively seeing their place in the overall scheme of things, and have the gift of being able to see any situation in terms of bigger and better future possibilities. Their big goals can seem very over the top at the outset, but it's surprising how often people with these contacts make their vision a reality. So I find that very interesting about him, because he certainly made his vision of being a rock star a reality, and a very big one at that. She also writes, because of its recklessness and carelessness and misplaced belief in divine protection, hard contacts between these planets can be quite accident prone. And I wanted to bring up a matter where in February of 2090, he actually got into a very serious accident where he almost lost his leg. And it took him some time to recover from that. And it really did change his perspective. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to another natal aspect with his son. But that's an example of perhaps, being a Sun-Jupiter person who kind of just almost feels like they are a god, because that's, what Jupiter can be symbolic of, is this sort of like divine protection, divine intervention. And finally, she writes, it's good for the stage too. For drama provides many opportunities for exaggeration, caricature, and self-promotion. Now, I wanted to move on to another natal aspect to his sun, and that's the fact that he has Sun squared Pluto. So he's got all of this, Sun in Sagittarius, conjunct Mercury in Sagittarius, squaring his Jupiter in Virgo. So he's got all this kind of like really sort of upbeat, outgoing, inspired energy, but then he's got this Sun squared Pluto. And his Pluto is at 28 degrees Leo. So if you think of the sun as the identity and the purpose, and Pluto has to do with deep transformation, and in the square, there can be some kind of challenge to that process of transformation. Now, this energy, Sun squared Pluto, because Sun is symbolic of the father, can be representative of some sort of strained relationship with the father. And Sue Tompkins writes about this when she says, there will often have been a very intense power struggle with the father in youth. But most positively, this only serves to make the father-child relationship a very real and potent one where real transformations of feelings may have occurred. So I also saw a video where Billy was talking about how he recently spent some time with his father during his passing, and that the father said to him, I'm sorry I didn't basically support you when you came out and said that you wanted to pursue this career as a musician. And Billy's response to his father was, Dad, it was a crazy idea. Basically saying, I understand why you wouldn't want to support that, So obviously there was some kind of tension between the two of them growing up. And I know Billy's also talked about sort of seeing his father's life and feeling like he wanted something different for himself. He didn't want to do it the same way that his father did. Of course, that's very Sun trine Uranus as well. But there was something there with the father, a struggle, a challenge. But it sounds like at some point, it became resolved towards the end of his father's life. And also, with going back to this serious accident that he experienced as a younger person in the 90s, and another website describes the Sun-Pluto contact in hard aspect as at some point these people may have to face some sort of, quote, death. Having survived their crisis, they become indestructible and exude that awesome aura of a phoenix rising that has been through the flames and comes out about 10 times stronger. And I'm bringing this up, maybe there were things along the way that brought about this kind of transformation in him, but definitely because of that accident that he had in the early 90s, he talked about it really waking him up to the fact that he needed to gain more control over his demons and to really become more of a father, because he had 2 children at that time and he didn't want to not be around for his kids as they grew up. So that was definitely one of those, Sun squared Pluto natal turning points in his life. I also wanted to mention that he had struggled with drug addiction in his life, and I'll get to why that is in his chart. But one of the things that one of his longtime musical partners, Steve Stevens, said about him was that he really didn't know the extent of Billy's drug use. And this would be a Sun-Pluto energy, somebody that doesn't fully kind of reveal themselves very easily. And Sue Tompkins writes, the individual seems to take pains to hide themselves. It isn't always that obvious or necessarily a conscious decision. Nevertheless, it's possible to, quote, know a Sun-Pluto person for years without ever seeming to get beyond first base in terms of understanding their inner dynamics. It's not that the feelings of closeness are necessarily absent. In fact, they will often be very strong. But the individuality of the Sun person is often hard to get a hold of, as are quite often the actual facts and feelings about their early life. So that's just another, point to make about the Sun-Pluto person. It's like they're here to deal with their shadow. And he certainly, went through that in his life. And again, Sue writes at the end, Pluto always refuses to treat life lightly. When coupled with the Sun, it is as if the individual just cannot deal with themselves or with life on a superficial basis. If they attempt to do so, some crisis will hurtle them back into the underworld. In many different ways, the Sun-Pluto person usually has innocence and naivete forcibly withdrawn from them at an early age. And there is really no going back afterwards. Part of the purpose of the Sun-Pluto interchange seems to be concerned with illuminating those things that are hidden, bringing what is buried out into the light of day where it can be acknowledged and valued, turning the spotlight on society's taboos, and thus transforming the collective attitude toward them. And again, there is his Sun connected to another transpersonal planet. So he becomes a beacon through his transformative process for kind of teaching or exposing issues around the Pluto energy to the rest of the world. So let's move on then to his Mars, because that's all of his Sun energy. Like I said before, he had drug issues, but I want to point out that in his chart, his Mars is at 1 degree Scorpio and his Neptune's at 29 degrees Libra. So he has a very tight conjunction between Mars and Neptune. And this is his love of music, because Mars is our action energy, our drive. And Neptune is, for one thing, it's our creative connection to music. So there it is in his chart. He's a musical person. And another expression of the Mars-Neptune energy, if it's not directed in certain ways, like through creative expression or imagination, because Neptune seeks transcendence, that it wants to transcend the ego. What can happen is we can seek the fast track to transcendence through drugs and alcohol. And that was part of how he lived his life. I mean, thankfully, he was able to get the music out there too. And sometimes musicians are inspired through the use of drug and alcohol to create the music that they do. So there is that piece of his chart. But what's also interesting is that Mars-Neptune is part of a T-square with Uranus and with Chiron. So to have his Mars squared Uranus, let's just take that piece of it. Again, it's Mars in Scorpio, which is a very sexual sign, Scorpio. So to have his male energy in the sign of Scorpio just means he's very driven by his sexual impulses. Well, not only that, it's his Mars squares Uranus, and that just makes him want a lot of freedom around his sexual expression. And you'll find him online talking about it and other people talking about it. His sexual drive was just through the roof, and he's got this saggy energy where he wants to just expand and explore, and then he's got this Mars squared Uranus. He definitely, if you want to, define hedonism through the sexual nature, I believe he probably experienced it, and maybe still does, I don't know. But definitely with that Mars squared Uranus, it's somebody who doesn't want to be, held back in the area of his sexual expression. And I wanted to read again something that Sue Tompkins says about people with Mars squared Uranus, because Lisa Gibbons, who was an interviewer at one point online on television, has something funny to say, and it definitely relates to his Mars-Uranus square. So Sue Tompkins writes about people with Mars squared Uranus. Come quickly can also be a sexual statement for Mars-Uranus, for these people seem to need and have a talent for generating sexual excitement, the only problem being difficulty in staying the course. For Mars-Uranus may get tired of you as soon as they have discovered that you are, to them, as boring as everyone else. So, you know, that's what he was born with. Now, she also writes, she writes, I heard the astrologer Dennis Elwell in a lecture once associate Mars-Uranus with flashers, and this set me thinking. Obviously, Mars-Uranus is a fairly common combination, and sexual flashers are not. Certainly, the typical Mars-Uranus person has the urge, and has been said, to generate and receive a great deal of sexual excitement. Perhaps most Mars-Uranus people flash their sexuality around in ways other than by, quote, flashing in the popular sense. The Mars-Uranus individual is very quick to take their clothes off. And in this Lisa Gibbons quote, she says, I used to really enjoy the rock and roll interviews because it's so, quote, not my world, Gibbons says with a smile. I'm kind of this good girl from the South. When you put a self-described good girl in a room with a wild rock legend, and she was interviewing Billy Idol, there's bound to be a good story. Gibbons' encounter with Billy was certainly a memorable one. She says, we were backstage with Billy and he just proceeded to get undressed. I thought, well, that's fine. Go ahead. Take everything off then. That's fine. And he did. So here's an example of somebody saying, they had a direct experience of his Mars-Uranus square. I just find that really funny. Oh, excuse me, one more thing about having Mars squared Uranus, and Sue Tompkins writes, this is also a good combination for fighting on the behalf of humanitarianism issues. Fighting for progress, a good combination for anything that requires pushing forward of some sort of reform. And again, remember, his Mars squared Uranus is connected to his Neptune. And his sun trines that Uranus. So his push for reform is connected to his music and is connected to his solar energy, you know, of wanting to broaden, you know, people's perspective. So I just find that interesting because, again, going back to what I was talking to in the beginning, this is where his music came from, you know. He moved into punk rock, but then he moved even beyond punk rock and said that the kind of music that he wanted to create was a combination of the roots of early rock mixed with dance music, as well as traditional rock and roll. So, you know, he really was creating kind of a new style when he came on the scene, especially during his solo career. So I want to go back again just a little bit more to this Mars-Neptune conjunction, because he did have a drug abuse problem and he overdosed in 1994. And if you look at his transits at that time in his life, transiting Pluto was moving over his Saturn. And Pluto moves so slowly, it will never go over some people's Saturn in a lifetime. It happened to be going over his Saturn in Scorpio during that year, and it really sobered him up, because again, Pluto's transformation and Saturn is structure and foundation, and his Saturn is in the energy of transformation, which is Scorpio. So, you know, it really took him deep. It sobered him up mostly. I mean, he says now he still smokes pot and has a drink occasionally, but he certainly doesn't do any hard drugs. But it also made him take the role of being a father more seriously. And again, Saturn is the symbol for a father, so it transformed his views around being a father as well. Now I want to move on to his Venus in Capricorn, and just mention that his Venus is in Capricorn, and right now Saturn happens to be going over his Venus, because Saturn just moved into Capricorn. So transiting Saturn's conjuncting his Venus, which I find interesting. I mean, Saturn is work, Venus is our creativity. He seems to be having kind of a revival right now of his work, And his natal Venus trines Jupiter and trines Pluto as well. So this just means that whenever anything happens to his Venus, his creativity, it stimulates that trine from Jupiter. You know, Jupiter's about luck, Jupiter's about expansion, and Pluto, with Jupiter-Pluto together, Pluto can really much be about creativity as well, harnessing the power of energy and putting it towards creativity. So that whole combination with his natal Venus, trine Jupiter, conjunct Pluto, is being transited right now by Saturn. So that could be part of the reason why he seems to, you know, be having some activity going on with his career right now. It could relate to things around his loving nature, around his relationships. We don't know those personal details of his life, but it, you know, it could be the ending of something with Saturn going over the Venus. And also something to point out is that to have Venus in Capricorn, there was a quote of him saying, because between the time that Rebel Yell came out in '83 and just exploded his career, it took him 3 more years to put out Whiplash Smile, his next album. And what he was quoted as saying in a video was that he didn't want to put out crap. You know, he wanted to make sure that every song on his next album was something that was listenable and that would stand the test of time. And that is very Venus in Capricorn, because Capricorn is about, you know, the mountain, the half mountain goat, half fish climbing the mountain. You know, it's about time. Saturn rules time. So I just find that interesting that his Venus is in Capricorn and he's defending himself saying, hey man, it took me time to put out my next album because I didn't want to put out crap. I wanted to put out something that people could appreciate and that would stand the test of time. I'm sorry. So going back to his Jupiter conjunct Pluto in his chart. To have Jupiter and Pluto together creates somebody who's very ambitious. And Sue writes, Jupiter-Pluto wants to do something very big. Just what will be shown by the planets or points the combination picks up, but this can be a very relentless and ruthless combination. Now again, this squares his sun, his identity. The Jupiter-Pluto person will often believe that anything is possible and whatever is wanted in life is obtainable if only one can set one's mind to it. But again, that's another really strong energy in his chart, along with the Sun trine Uranus and the Sun squared the Jupiter-Pluto and then the Mars-Neptune squared the Uranus. You know, he just really was, you know, meant to just really, you know, live the life that he's lived. It's pretty amazing. So finally, going back to this T-square, which involves that Mars-Neptune that I was talking about, which is his musical creativity, but it's also that susceptibility to drug use. And then the Mars-Neptune squares the Uranus. So that can bring in, of course, we talked about somebody who's a trailblazer, but also somebody who has a really strong sex drive, and also somebody who loves to kind of, you know, expose themselves. But to have Mars and Neptune together squaring Uranus, this could bring kind of this part of him that just wanted to do drugs, like fuck it. Like Uranus is like freedom, you know, but it's almost too much when it's squaring that Mars-Uranus. It's too much, and you have to learn where the boundaries are, you know, where it's like too much freedom is going to cause you problems in that scenario. And obviously, you know, it did. And there's some other funny story that he told about how he was really messed up on drugs once, and he even pissed off Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones, and they kind of said, take a hike. Of course, I'm sure they don't feel that way about him now, but to be able to, you know, piss off Keith Richards, who probably rivaled him as far as, you know, level of drug use, is a pretty big feat, you know. So this, you know, is part of his Mars conjunct Neptune squared Uranus gone awry. And the other part of the T-square here is that Mars-Uranus squares his Chiron. And Chiron is in Aquarius. And I've talked about Chiron and Aquarius before in some other people's charts that I've read. Chiron is our wound, and Uranus has to do with the wound around being an individual, feeling your individuality, feeling comfortable in your individuality. So I'm sure that music helped him feel more comfortable with that with that wounded energy of feeling like, you know, you stand out or you don't fit in, that kind of thing. And maybe even the kind of music that he gravitated towards, because to have his Mars squared to have his Mars conjunct Neptune squared Uranus, that's going to give somebody an interesting style of music, and perhaps an even violent style, which punk was, you know, because Mars is the warrior energy, you know, and Uranus is just this unpredictability. I mean, that's very punk. Mars conjunct Neptune squared Uranus. And then with the square to Chiron, it just, you know, perhaps music became an outlet for feeling that chironic wound of not fitting in. So to wrap things up, I just want to talk about a few transits that were happening in his life when some things went on. In 1982, he embarked on a solo career. Because remember, he was in the UK, he was with Generation X. In 82, Uranus went into his sun sign. And that's when he moved to New York. And that's when White Wedding was written. And so he was beginning to feel the inklings, you know, of something amazing beginning to happen in his life. But this was his solo embarkment, because he was in a band prior in the UK. And so he moved to New York City on his own, and this was the beginning of his solo career, Uranus going into his sun sign. Then in 1983, when Rebel Yell came out, Uranus was right on his sun at 7 degrees. And that's when he had a huge breakthrough with MTV, and you know, his career just skyrocketed. And again, Uranus does not always conjunct somebody's sun in a lifetime by transit. This is unique because Uranus moves so slowly. So that to me is just so cool that you can see how things just really exploded for him when Uranus went into his sun sign, and then when it actually conjuncted his sun. And at the same time, another transit was going on in 81 when he moved to New York, and that was Pluto was trining his moon. And his moon is his home, literally. It's everybody's home in their chart. So, you know, there was some sort of transformation happening literally with where he lived. But also the moon is the expression of our emotions, of our feelings, of, you know, our intuitive self. And something was changing there for him. You know, something was happening, some kind of personal transformation around his you know, deeper intuitive self, deeper feeling self. It was actually probably giving him a lot of energy and a lot of power and a lot of creativity to begin to express himself, because that's part, you know, to express his feelings, his deeper self. And I'll just make one last statement about that, which I find interesting, because you know, going back, his sun is in the 7th house, like I mentioned before. And I feel that a lot of what he writes about has been about relationships, even though he has not had like the traditional marriage and that kind of thing. His solar energy, his purpose has played itself out in that 7th house way, because he does write a lot about the experiences in relationships and the experiences of what it's like, you know, to feel in relationships. So this has been my interpretation of Billy Idol's chart. There's so much more I could say, but I just was excited to get this out here and talk to you about him, because I think he's just such a cool individual, and he really just, you know, has lived his chart, and he's still going strong. It's amazing. If you like my channel, please subscribe. If you're interested in having your chart read by me, I do readings. You can contact me at lindsayc73@gmail.com. I want to say happy winter solstice to everybody, and happy holidays. I hope that they're safe, and take care, and adios.